Hey guys, welcome to Quinian's Budget Crafts. In the second module, we're going to need a few things, but we'll start with the Spiders Ravine. So the first thing you're going to need is another piece of EPS cut to 8x12, and a bunch of scrap pieces of EPS to make the cliffs. Just like in previous videos, it's pretty much impossible to put a grid on the EPS, so we're going to glue some dollar store ready board onto this. Just some Super 77 and stick it on. Then flip it over and trim off the excess, and go ahead and put the grid on it, just like we did in the tavern build. And don't forget to run a stylus or a ballpoint pen through those lines to widen it up. Okay, so using the grid that's on the printout as a guide, I'm going to try to redraw the cliffside they have here, just so I have some kind of idea of where the cliff is. Then take you a couple pieces of EPS that are scraps and stuff, trace the cliff onto it as best you can, and cut some chunks off to make it sort of match. Doesn't need to be exact. Now if you're going to use a bunch of scraps like this instead of a whole sheet, it really helps if you cut the ends of them nice and flat so you can get them to stick together really well. Then get you another piece of scrap and line it up so it sticks right. And repeat that until you have enough to cover the whole thing. Don't forget to draw your cliff on as best you can. On this piece of scrap that I'm going to use for the end, where the canyon comes right to the edge of the tile, I drew it in just a little bit so that there's still some canyon height left on the end there. I don't want to cut all the way to the edge. And a piece of scrap for the other side. Just use the edge of your knife there and scrape along to make some sort of wall looking thing. And to attach these, we're just going to use some more Super 77. Make sure to spray the scrap and not your whole piece, or the whole thing will be a sticky mess. Also, when you spray these, make sure you spray the edge where the edges of the pieces of scrap are going to touch each other. Stick it all down, and then flip it over and trim off the excess. Now for the other scraps to build up the height, these don't need to be quite as exact. The bottom ones are acting as a guide, so these ones you can just kind of stick on however and trim it later. We're going to go 3 layers high in total. Same idea as the others, just trim them kind of close to the size you need and stick them on with some Super 77. And don't forget to spray the very ends too so they'll stick together. What I did is I sprayed all of these and then laid them out sticky side up so I could just keep putting them on. If you have a whole bunch of excess, go ahead and flip it over and trim some of that off just so it's not in your way. And then, go in with your knife and start carving out a cliffside. The bottom one is acting as a guide for you, but the whole wall doesn't need to be perfectly flat or anything like that. I mean, it's supposed to be a canyon. Just cut off the large excess and then use the edge of the blade to scrape off whatever you want to sort of sculpt it. Alright, now it kind of looks like we murdered a styrofoam cooler. So in order to get your walls nice and flat, it really helps to have a hot wire. I'm not sure if this could be done with a knife at all just because of how thick it is. So my hot wire table is not good at all. I tried using a metal ruler as a guide here to keep it from cutting into the thing. But without a table to rest the rest of the project on and stuff, it's just a mess. Definitely buy a Proxon. That is on my wish list. Go ahead and do any last minute finish sculpting. And vacuum up the mess. And now, if your sides came out a wavy mess like mine, you can take some coarse grit sandpaper and just sand it down nice and flat. The corner here didn't quite glue all the way. If that happens to you, it's not a problem. Just put a little dab of hot glue and stick it down. That'll be fine. Okay, so in order to make the ravine line up with your tiles, you're going to have to sand off the edge of the ready board that you stuck on so that the height is the same. You can use that same coarse grit sandpaper or something like this little emery board. I like the sandpaper because it works faster. Just sand that all the way back down to the EPS at an angle. Then take you some Mod Podge and black paint mixed together and coat the entire thing. Make sure you get it all in the EPS. All where you're carving and stuff is going to have a lot of void, so make sure you really stab it in there. And don't forget to do the sides, back, bottom. Make sure you do all of it, every last bit. You don't want to see any bit of white. I'm scooping up quite a bit of this Mod Podge mix and then layering it on pretty heavy. Gotta make sure you get all those little holes. If you want, you can wait for the rest of that to dry and then flip it over and do the bottom. Since you weren't carving on the bottom, it shouldn't take quite as much, but still make sure you don't miss any of it. Okay, so for painting, I'm going to start out with pavement and coat the inside of the rock face as well as the top. And then with some nutmeg brown, just go ahead and paint your entire grid area. That's where the dirt's going to be. You can bring it up the side just a little bit too if you want. And then do the top too. And when you do the top, make sure you bring the brush over the edge just a little bit, like dirt falling from the top into the bottom. Then with some lighter brown, this one is territorial beige, go over your rock face. Not real heavy, just get it in there a little bit. You can maybe poke it in some of the holes if you want. Rocks generally aren't only gray, so throw in a little bit of lighter brown and dirt color. You could use brighter colors or actual colors if you wanted to. And I had some of that spill down onto the dirt portion too. While the tan is mostly dry but still damp, go in with pewter and cover your rock face again, but this time it's kind of a dry brush. Once that is completely dry, go in with a real light dry brush of granite gray. When you do the tops, bring the brush over the top just a little bit too, kind of blending the colors back and forth. I went through on the grass portion with Kelly Green as an undercoat, but that was really unnecessary because I used a whole lot of flocking. It depends on how you want to flock it or how green you want the floor to be. And I made that pretty splotchy. I also put that on top where there will be grass. Once the paint is totally dry, go in with some Mod Podge and put some drops down. And use a paintbrush to kind of spread it some. This is going to be for where your dirt and sand piles are sticking. Use that same dirt mix from the trees video and just kind of cover everything. You just want to make sure all the glue is good and covered. Then shake off your excess and repeat it on top. Now put down a whole bunch of 50-50 Mod Podge and water. And then use that same green dust stuff we had from doing the trees. If you want, you can buy a professional grade flocking for this, but this seems to work pretty well. And then do the same thing on top. Like I said, I used entirely too much of this, I didn't realize. You'll see the problem later. When you do it on top though, make sure you don't go quite to the edge. You do want some dirt on the edge of where the rocks separate from the grass. And then once you think you've got enough of it down, just go ahead and sort of gently pat it down. Make it stick into the glue. If you ended up having any little clumps, that's fine. Actually, it adds a lot. It kind of looks like bushes. Just make sure you smush them down into the glue with your finger. So that's looking pretty good, but it's very green. So get a little bit of brown paint on your brush and wipe it off on a paper towel so you have just a little bit, and then go through and dry brush all of the grass. Anywhere you want sort of a dead spot in the grass, just kind of poke at it a little bit, like around the edges. So now take some of those fish tank rocks and mix them in a cup with some Mod Podge and make little rock piles like you have here on the drawing. Once you've got them all in place, put some extra Mod Podge with water on them. It's just to help make them stick to everything. So this is what I'm calling very dirty brown wash. It's about 70% brown with 30% black wash. We're going to use that to spray the grass and the rocks, everything, kind of dull it down a little bit. But what you want to do is spray it kind of heavy along the edge and then up on the rock face a little bit above that so it looks like dirt washing down from the top into the bottom. Kind of think of it like mud. And then just a light spray on the rest of the grass. These rocks are looking a little out of place with the cliffside there. So I made some heavily watered down gray paint and just kind of went over the tops of them to kill that brown a little bit. It does show up better in person. So you might have noticed there's almost no grid here anymore. That's why I said I used too much flocking. It actually shows up in person better than it is on the camera. It's just very faint. So the drawing does show a bunch of tree trunks and spider webs and that kind of stuff. But I didn't want to put that stuff in there permanently because that way you can use this canyon for other encounters. You can always fill in whatever you want inside the canyon with your scatter terrain. And there you go. Neat little ravine that you can use in a whole bunch of different kind of settings, as long as those settings include grass. And you just populate it with whatever scatter works for your game. So thank you for watching, everybody. Don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.